Welcome to the Indie Author Showcase, the podcast by indie authors for indie authors. I am your host, multi-award-winning author Chad Robert Morgan, and I'll be honest with you, I'm feeling a little under the weather. We had a great Son of Monsterpalooza, but I think I took home an extra souvenir I hadn't meant to. I have a little bit of a head cold, so I will try to trudge through this. I am not feeling my best, but it is what it is. So, let me start by talking about the last episode that I did, because as normal, I take the podcast, I run it through Opus Clip, cut it up into little chunks, throw it up on the social medias, and some of those were getting a few comments. Mostly positive, there's a couple bad ones, but one thing I was talking about was how there was a throwaway line in the book Needful Things that broke my suspension of disbelief. And that was buying a brand new Commodore 64. And I said at the time, nobody would have bought a brand new Commodore 64. And several people came to Commodore 64's defense. They said, look, Needful Things came out in 1991, and they did not stop selling the Commodore 64 till 94. So yes, it was possible for somebody to buy a new Commodore 64 at the time of that book. Yes, it is technically possible. And they kept saying, well, remember how expensive computers are. Well, okay, small problem with that. First of all, the Commodore 64 was only $200, but it had no storage. You had to buy that separately. By that point, you had to buy the floppy disk drive separately, which was an additional $200. So now you're into $400 territory, and no computer at the time was coming with monitors, right? So again, remember that by the time you're paying that much money, you are into the price of a 386, and a 386 was going to run Windows 3.1, which was the new thing, right? Because I remember about that time I was going to the military PX, and I believe that's when I skipped the 386, and when I had I had upgraded my Commodore 64 to a secondhand rebuilt 286, and then I skipped the 386 and went straight to the 486, which I believe cost me at the military PX about $500 at the time, which had, I think, about 4 megs of RAM. Both 3 1/4 and 5 inch floppy drives. And keep in mind that the military PX is not exactly where you get cutting edge technology, right? This is like a Walmart, right? You're going to get kind of middle of the road consumer electronics. You're not going to get the high end stuff, right? You're not going to get crap, because there was no Commodore 64s at the military PX. But you weren't going to get super high-end stuff. Also keep in mind, the Amiga had come out in somewhere around 85, right? 86. So, even Commodore was replacing the Commodore 64 with the Amiga. The Commodore 64 was an 8-bit machine. By the time you got into Windows 3.1, you were running at 32-bit processing. These days, we're running at 64. The Commodore 64 had 64 kilobytes of RAM. Okay? My first 286, its base memory was 640 kilobytes. And that base memory was that was where the kernel would go in. Like, I remember trying to reconfigure my AutoExec back in my config sys so I could squeeze all the drivers I needed into that kernel of memory so I could play certain video games. That's the kind of thing you don't have to deal with in modern computers anymore. But back in the day, you had to fit all your drivers and everything into that core memory. And there would be times when, like, okay, I need my sound card to work, but I don't have room for that and the modem, so how do I get the LAN party to work? So, and that was the kind of stuff I was in when Needful Things came out. Okay, because I was in the military. Um, I got out right at the beginning of '95, right? And Needful Things was published in '91. So, right about the beginning. So, '91 was right about the 386 era, right? So, we're kind of in this transition period. So, is it possible that he did buy, the character in the book did buy his son a brand new Commodore 64 when we were going from 16-bit to 32-bit? And the Commodore 64 was an 8-bit, that we already had the Commodore Amiga out. Yeah, I guess technically it's possible. But do you see how much kind of hurdles we have to jump in order to get there? Now, maybe, again, Needful Things takes place in rural Maine. The experience in rural Maine may be a lot different than my experience at a military base or here in California. So, again, this could be kind of perception bias from my standpoint, just trying to be fair. But at the same time, that's the kind of thing. I mean, if you have to make this much kind of tap dancing explanation to try to explain why it works or why it doesn't work, you really shouldn't put something in there unless you can hang a lantern on it. Like if it talked about him buying the new computer and then maybe his son bitched that, oh, but everybody's on these modern Apple IIe's, but he couldn't afford that or something like that, that might have helped sell it a little bit. That might have massaged it a little bit. I don't know. To me, I stand by what I said. It breaks my suspension of disbelief. At the time I read it, I didn't even think Commodore 64s were still being sold, which, again, I've been proven wrong. They were sold for about 5 more years since the writing of this book. Don't know who was buying these, but they were out there, apparently, somewhere. So, and that actually brings for a very good point. If you want to really date your book, talk about the technology you're being used. Talk about the technology that's being used. Because technology changes so rapidly that the minute you put in, I had the iPhone 5, boom, it's dated. Right? You are putting a big stamp on when this story takes place, whether you mean to or not. Now, that may not necessarily be bad if you're doing a period piece, right? If you have a person who is, you're doing Stranger Things, you want it to be in the 80s, you might want to highlight technology that is definitely 80s, like a Sony Walkman, for example, to really sell home that this is in the 80s. By the same token, you want to make sure you don't have an MP3 player, because that would have been technology that hadn't come out yet. So you got to be very careful about using technology in your book. But if you want to put a timestamp on your book, tell them what cell phone you're using. Talk about what graphics card you have in your computer. Any tech head is going to see that, and he's going to know immediately. I mean, look at some really old science fiction, like even old Star Trek, where they had the big discs, the big cartridges, and they stick it into the computer. Even that, that was cutting edge tech in the 60s. And now it looks woefully antiquated. It looks like an old Nintendo. You're sticking the trying to avoid specifics with technology unless you are specifically doing a period piece. That will help keep your story pigeonholed into a certain time period. Me personally, when I write, I like to try to keep it kind of loose, like it could happen pretty much any time. It can happen today, it can happen tomorrow, it can happen next year, it can happen last year. I try not to, and if you want a good example of how that can bite you in the ass, just look at the MCU. look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There was a huge uproar when they did Spider-Man Homecoming, and they put a date 5 years later, and people started going nuts, going, well, wait a minute, because this incident happened here, and then this happened, so this would actually have been about 7 years, and this would, I mean, and people started picking it apart to no end, saying that the timelines didn't match up. If you're gonna mark when your story takes place, you better be damn sure that you got every date correct, because somebody's going to poke that. I like to try to keep it as ambiguous as possible. I don't want my stories to take place in a certain time period. I want it to be timeless, in my opinion. So I do try to avoid anything that might call when the story is actually taking place. So I try. You can't avoid it 100%. I mean, in this day and age, if you don't have a cell phone, what's wrong with you? But you can avoid, getting too specific about what the cell phone is. Like, is it an old Nokia flip phone, or is it an iPhone 27 from the future kind of thing? I mean, it's like you don't have to get into specifics. Cell phone, character has a cell phone. Okay, well that's putting you in a range, but it's still a pretty wide range. If you start getting into the point where your phone has a screen and you're running apps, that might narrow that, but even Blackberries had a bit of a screen back in the day, so I mean it brings the start date up a little bit, but you can fudge it a little bit. But that's my 2 cents on it. And like I said, I think, getting back to the needful things, bought him a new computer. That's all he had to say. Once he said Commodore 64, he put a timestamp on it. It was a timestamp that didn't fit with my personal experience, which, again, to those detractors, it was technically possible. Maybe it's more of an East Coast, West Coast thing, or more of a city rural thing, that why it doesn't really fit well with but the whole thing could have been just avoided if he just said, bought him a new computer. Why mention a specific brand, especially one that was so on the way out at the time? So, but I do dig that we were getting comments about this, right? Because it starts that conversation, and so I'm thrilled that I got that pushback, that people was like, no, this technically could have happened, and Commodore 64 was way cheaper, and all this kind of stuff. Don't really agree with you, but I do like that we can have that conversation. I love it. I love that we can converse like that. I do have a little bit of advantage because I can just go on the podcast and speak my my point of view without contradiction. So I am cheating a bit. But keep the comments coming. And again, I do concede it is technically possible. I still say it's unlikely in the extreme, but it was technically possible. But I would like to hear more, like, how likely it would have been from, like somebody growing up in Maine. Like, it just, was Maine a little bit behind the times or something? Or, I mean, was it likely to see that kind of thing in more rural shops? Because, I mean, like I said, I'm here in Orange County. I'm here in LA. I'm more cutting edge. We get the new NVIDIA graphics card. There's a line around the block. Then again, now we're living in the age of Amazon. So is anybody really behind the times? Would that have happened if it was modern era? Right? Like, Commodore 64 really had a long shelf life, surprisingly. But would it have survived so long if we were in the internet age and people could have gotten more state-of-the-art hardware beyond what was available in their town, kind of thing? I've had a similar problem where I was doing a project up at my dad's. They used to have a Fry's, but Fry's, of course, went belly up and all the stores closed. So we needed a Raspberry Pi board. And there was nowhere anywhere near where my dad lived that had anything like that. You're not going to, I mean, at the time, you couldn't just walk down to your nearest Best Buy. They weren't going to carry it. Fry's was gone. That would have been our best shot at the time. But they had folded. So just nobody even knew what it was. So, we got stuck. We couldn't work on it until we got home. So, yeah, maybe it's a perception thing. Maybe it's just, my viewpoint is skewed. And I'm a little spoiled because we have access to this stuff where I'm at. So, but like I said, internet, I could have, if I was going to be at my dad's for any length of time, could have just ordered one on Amazon, have it delivered in a day or two, and bada bing, bada boom. So, yeah, let me know. Let's keep that conversation going. I'd like to hear people's opinions on that. Because I think this is a good conversation. I like it. But it also presents another challenge. It's like, if this is a perception that is just, rural Maine, how do you sell that to your reader, right? Because maybe in 1991, in a more rural Maine, maybe they were still selling Commodore 64s on the shelf. But that would not have happened here in LA, or it would have been unlikely. So like, how do you expand your reach so that you're not, you're not like your LA crowd, we wouldn't have Commodore 64s, maybe, somehow hang a lantern on that this doesn't fit. But yeah, all good topics of conversation. I would love to hear more about this from you guys. Moving on a bit, because again, I'm sick and I'm rambling a little bit. I really do need a co-host. I'm still searching for a co-host. I think this show comes out better when it's not just me talking to a screen. I want a second person, and I'm looking. Just trying to put some feelers out at Son of Monsterpalooza, which is my next topic. Son of Monsterpalooza was incredibly successful for us. Fridays are always a little slow at whatever convention. It doesn't matter. They're always slow because people are at work. They're coming after work. Our Friday was actually pretty decent for a Friday, right? We hit into Saturday. Saturday was incredibly busy. Lines around the convention center. Apparently, they had members from Iron Maiden, and that was a huge draw. And so, we were swamped. We were busy. Sunday, I show up, and there's like nobody outside. I'm like, oh God, this is going to be bad. And I didn't see anybody when I showed up on Sunday. I don't know where the crowds came from, but they eventually showed up. And we were pretty busy on Sunday. All in all, I don't know if I sold more books than usual, but I definitely sold a lot of hardcover, which meant my ROI was higher. And my income was higher. So I actually did phenomenally well. And again, it's Son of Monsterpalooza. It's a smaller convention. I'm just buying a table. I don't have a full 10x10 booth. So the cost of entry is lower. So I made almost as much as I did at the main show, Monsterpalooza in May, with a lot less investment. So I made a profit for I wasn't just breaking even. I got into the black. I was making profit. So, fantastic show for us. When I went to check in at Son of Monsterpalooza, it's like, name, Spectral. And they're like, oh, how are you doing? Yeah, we know about, you're healing up all right. I mean, they were asking me about the accident from the last Monsterpalooza, which was very sweet of them. I do appreciate them reaching out and just checking on me. That was very kind, and I appreciate that. And I am still healing. I'm getting better. There's still a little bit of swelling here where they put the two ends together. And there is still a little bit of pain in the knee if you hit it at just the right spot. But for the most part, I'm functional. I'm back together again. I'm walking around. I don't look too terribly hideous, or at least not more so than I was. Um, so yeah, very good show. Son of Monsterpalooza went very, very well, and I'm very, very happy with that show. Um, One other thing I want to mention, based on some of the comments I've gotten, I am not Brendan Fraser. I actually kind of take that as a compliment, because Brendan Fraser, back in the '80s was a handsome dude, and um, he's still not a bad looking. I mean, he's way older now, but then again, so am I. I literally turned 54 this month. I am an old fucking man. So Brendan Fraser and I are both old, and I think for our age, we look okay. We look pretty good. I'm not going to compete with Brendan Fraser from the 80s, but Brendan Fraser today, yeah, okay, I can see that. But yeah, I loved him in Doom Patrol. If you've never watched Doom Patrol, that is a good show. And Brendan Fraser basically just does the voice of one of the characters. He does show up there in live action a few times. I think like in 3 episodes throughout the whole thing. But yeah, so. But no, I'm not Brendan Fraser. Sorry. All right, so that's all the business we need to take care of. Let's get into this week's showcase. I met this gentleman at LA Comic Con, and his book was on Audible, so that kind of helped put it towards the top of the list. Again, these days I have been very busy, working multiple jobs, so anything I can listen to becomes a huge asset. But I dove into Pulling Strings by Nick DeWolf. And I just want to say, this was a good, solid book, right? This is sort of like if they took control and took out the David Lynch aspect of it, right? Because what we have is a secret government organization, a secret FBI, if you will, full of psychics, called the DSI, the Department of Scientific Investigation. And we are following basically 2 groups of people. We're following Agent Colt, who's at the start of the book, because we get like a 6-chapter prologue or something like that, which was really good. I was like listening to this, man, this just feels like a prologue. Turns out it was just a very multi-chaptered prologue. But we're introduced to Colt, kind of more or less in her prime, dealing with a case. And then we are introduced to our antagonists, who are children at the time. And then then the book skips about maybe 10 years, maybe 8 years, something like that. Colt is now more grizzled veteran of the DSI, a little bit of a legend in some people's eyes, and our antagonists have grown in power. What we wind up with is a unique type of psychic enemy known as a puppeteer. This is a person that can just kind of wriggle into your brain and start taking control. And so we have this family that has 2 sets of twins. And the first twins are Vincent and Mary. And Mary is the puppeteer. And I'm not really spoiling things too much, because we kind of see that in the prologue, right? And her twin brother Vincent's kind of like the muscle, and she's the one manipulating this entire town. And Colt sort of stumbles on these victims showing up, and she's kind of sees a thread, both figuratively and like literally coming through the ether, and she starts investigating. And so this is I mean, this was, it was like an FBI procedural with people with mind powers. It was like FBI Coruscant, if all the FBI agents were Jedis that weren't allowed to use lightsabers. You know what I mean? I mean, it was a very fascinating story, and I don't want to get too farther into it because I don't want to get into spoiler territory. But it was a good, solid book, and it was definitely, how do I want to say? It was a good, solid book. It was a good. I mean, if you want your crime procedural with a little bit of X-Files sprinkled into it, if you ever want to know if the X-Men could solve a criminal case kind of thing, this is your book, because I was impressed. It worked well. Just one note, and this is one thing that I had to go back and listen to. It stuck out to me. I found one error in the audiobook where the narrator repeated a line, and I was a little sympathetic because I had just uploaded Fear to ACX, and one of the reasons I waited so long was I had my wife listen to the entire audiobook as kind of a QA process. I wanted a second pair of ears on it, and she would leave me notes saying, or she would come home from work, she'd be listening to it on her drive home, and she says, yeah, chapter 7, you repeated a line twice. Okay, here it is right there. And I would go and I would edit it back out. So I was cutting me doing duplicate lines left and right from my work before I uploaded it. So I know how easy it is to miss that. When you have a 12-hour book or whatever, 12, 14 hours, and you're hearing yourself talk for the upteenth time, because you heard yourself when you recorded it, you heard yourself when you did the initial edit, you start getting deaf to your own voice at that point. You really need another pair of ears to go through it, which is what I was relying on my wife to do for me. So hopefully I have removed all the duplicate lines in my book. Hopefully. But yeah, no, I sympathize. But yeah, it was towards the end. It was about the third to the last chapter. And there was definitely a line that was duplicated. And the other thing too is it's not impossible, but it's a royal pain to re-upload to ACX. Once your stuff is approved, changing it after the fact is hard. It's not impossible. You can do it. I've done it. But it's not, there's even more weird constraints in formatting and everything you have to go through in order to do that again. It's a weird process. I don't know why they make it that difficult. I really don't. It'd be nice if you could you can't re-upload just the one chapter you fix. You have to re-upload the entire book. I don't know why they make you do that. It's weird. It really, truly is weird. I would love it if ACX fixed that and made it a little bit more easier to fix your book after the fact. But yeah, other than that one minor hiccup that I almost didn't even notice, like I was like, did I hear that, or did the GPS force it to repeat itself, or that kind of thing? Because sometimes when you're driving, the GPS will, and then the killer came around the corner and turn left here, and then it forces Audible to rewind about 10 seconds, and then it repeats the line. So I was starting to wonder if I had heard what I heard, but no, I rewound it. It was there. But yeah, anyway, other than that little minor hiccup, I thought it was a really strong book, and it was again, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but it is way the adventure expands beyond, like, there's these secondary characters that actually wind up with this big huge major subplot going on in the book that, like, I didn't see really coming. I thought they were just sort of like background characters kind of thing, and it's like, and it's like you start really like, oh my god, I hope they make it okay, that kind of thing. Just a very well done book. So if you're up to your psychic investigators, your FBI mind control people, then this book is for you. Anyway, my throat's going out. Hopefully next week I will be feeling better. And in the meantime, keep on reading.